I appear to be the only one with like an agenda item today. It's basically like we got a room in KubeCon. We should figure out what we're doing with it.
I did see Marcin had another item too. So not the
Yes.
only, but that is a big one. So it's nice to see KubeCon coming up.
What I'm likely to do is just basically like link us back into like the HackMD in here and have the events team just use this particular Zoom room. Because we've done that before. It's pretty straightforward. And I know this group will have no agenda and then we'll be talking for like 2 hours straight about like whatever comes up. So I think we'll be fine. I just kind of wanted like you all, is there anything really pressing that we need to be able to like do like a longer working session around?
We do have a number of things that have been working through. I don't know if there's any one of them that we specifically want to call out or if we just want to have plenty of time to talk about everything.
We can go either way. We could also, I don't know, I guess we could do backlog grooming. That always makes everybody happy. Brian, is that actually ready to be able to I'm reading the issue now. Is this actually ready to discuss? Okay. Ah, okay. All right. The answer is maybe. Okay, cool. All right, that was all. I will make sure that we at least have space for this, even if we don't have like a full agenda and all of that. But we can at least rock and roll a bit. So, Brandon, back to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other official agenda item, and we'll probably go other directions here. But I believe it was, I got to wait for the mouse over to show up here. Marcin, you had the other.
Yes, I have the other. So I finished the pull request. I think I addressed most of the comments in there, and I consider this done. So I would like to kindly ask TOB members, Brandon, you, John, and Derek. I see you are here. So I would like to kindly ask you to take a look and kick off the voting process as well. Like if you can vote, would be great if you have time. So yeah, basically that's it from my side.
Yeah. In our
Just
voting process, I think, I don't remember if we do it only in the, so I know other votes that we actually have to do on two, on the issue. Some of us will put a couple thumbs up over there, and we also do it in the email. I think for working group, we just, I think we just do it inside of the GitHub pull request itself.
okay.
And someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I haven't gone back and looked to see specific, but it is on my personal to-do list. I have a bunch of GitHub notifications that I intentionally leave marked as unread so I can go back and spend some time looking through it. And that is on mine right now, of specifically going through there and making sure that I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and then we'll get that thing spun up.
Okay, thank you.
I guess John, Derek, anybody else has had a chance to look at that one? Questions, comments?
For voting on starting the working group.
Yeah, the image compatibility working group.
I've taken a look at it. I didn't have any comments.
Yeah. As warned, Marcin, we are notoriously slow on some of these things, so don't be surprised if it takes us a little while to get through it. But it is on our list, so nothing more that you have to do that I know of right now. It's all on our plate.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, that ends the official agenda. Who wants to talk about something else today? There's always something else with this group. I know, Derek, you and I were back and forth at DockerCon last week chatting about the registries rejecting non-existent subjects. I haven't seen anything from Bjorn on that one. I think they're going to work on getting a GitHub a Google Doc together. We could sync up and then throw this up for a vote. Has there been any progress you're aware of on that?
No, So you want to put that in a Google Doc first and discuss, talk about having the different point counterpoint.
I believe that was Bjorn's intention. I kind of started throwing some of my ideas in just a hack MD, but I do want to make sure this gets out for a vote before too long. I don't want to leave it idle forever. And if you're saying anything there, Eric, you're on mute.
Yeah, that just sounds good to me. I don't have anything else to discuss about it. My brain's drained on it.
Yeah, we've all chatted about this one so much. Let's see. And the issue tracking the vote. I'll link over to the issue itself there. Put it over here. The vote is not in that issue. We'll have something else, but we'll link it into that issue when that happens. I'll also put it in the meeting notes here as well. I feel like that is the one that we're most held up on right now. I'm going to start getting attendee names here, putting the doc before people start running off on us. Anybody else have topics you want to discuss today?
There was one thing that we ran into and kind of wanted to bring up. An interesting scenario where config blobs were massive. And so curious about, is there any way or anything we could do or any sort of same limits to set around config blob size? I think there is something around manifest sizes that were put in, I think limiting those to about 4 meg. But I think we ran into an issue where there was a config blob that was over 300 meg in size, which caused a lot of performance issues on downloading and parsing and processing. And so maybe something to hash out, discuss, limit something.
That seems like a pretty big config blob. What was the media type on that config blob?
It ended up being some inline cache, built-kit inline cache that was appended into the config blob. Not entirely sure how it got that large and why, and all this news around that. But it caused some downstream issues, to say the least. So we were at least trying to figure out if there's a way to update, or something we were thinking about doing was essentially validating the manifest push, or the manifest push, and rejecting the manifest if the config was what was above a certain size was about the only thing that we could easily do on that front. But
yeah, if the media type doesn't say that it is a OCI image config, then I don't know how much say we have in that. A registry can always reject things.
So they're specifically, right? So a config is a blob. So when we do a put or a post with that blob or a patch, the media type is defined by the distribution spec to be application octet stream. So when a registry is receiving a blob, the blob is opaque. It's a byte stream, and there's no interpretation. After you receive a manifest that has a descriptor referencing that blob, now it becomes something that actually you have opinions about, because, oh, I might want to populate the image history, the build history in my UI or something. I need to parse that out. But like in the case that Jeff is referring to, the media type is application OCI image config JSON. So it is a image. It's not an artifact. Standard config media type. And the issue is just that for that standard config media type, where the registry does have opinions on what's inside and wants to parse them out, there's actually no upper bound on how big that blob can be. And so from an implementation standpoint, this is easy to solve. You go around and add a bunch of limit readers. You go around and add some size checks. For a registry, like Docker Hub, it's, for Docker Hub, it's not too difficult to say a blob is a blob, but a blob, of course, is useless unless it's referenced by something. So I receive a manifest. Oh, the size in the manifest descriptor for the config blob is too big. I reject the manifest, and then the blob falls out due to GC because nothing ever referenced it. Like, that's doable, but I think it's also sort of a it would be good to have guidance on how big the config can be in the case of an image, just like there has been for the manifest, so that at least there's some consensus on behavior. Because like, this is all solvable in implementations, but doing it piecemeal and not having consensus on what the suggested or recommended behavior is definitely is a little more painful.
I'm kind of between John's comment and leave it as a registry specific comment here. So John's comment is, don't bother rejecting it, just don't even bother parsing it. And you would just have an image that doesn't have any UX functionality on top of it that gives, pulls out details and shows it to the user on the web page. It would just show as an unknown kind of image, and users would have to deal with that on their side. The other option is that this becomes a very registry specific implementation, and some registries would say, hey, we don't want that content on our registry. And we've seen that in the past. Not thrilled about it, but we've definitely seen that in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an option, and we can definitely work around it. I think it was kind of more of, are config blobs meant to be general purpose? You can shove anything you want in them, or should they actually have a fairly strict JSON format of these are the fields that are expected? And I think, speaking with Bjorn and others about that, I think there is a lot of things within Containerd or within Moby that sort of expect this to be a fast, easily parsable type of thing. And this sort of breaks that assumption. And so maybe it is okay, and we'll just put in safeguards of not doing that, and then we'll kind of have some unexpected behavior if someone tries to do something, and maybe it's different depending on what tools they use. But it's kind of also, if you're shoving this much stuff inside of a config, there's probably a better way to do that.
Absolutely. Definitely a better way. I would not put it in there saying that as an image config if it was me. I would also say that it is not a registry concern, but this is a client tooling concern, because you as a client are going to try to read this. And at that point, maybe that client should put some thresholds on itself and say, you know what, this thing is so large, I'm not even going to bother trying to download it because it doesn't look like a real image config to me.
Right. And the thing is that, like, the image config is very specifically extensible. Just like with the manifest, there is the clause that unknown fields in the image config should not be rejected. If an implementation doesn't know how to interpret it, it should take no action. So, there's been various shades of this over the years. Like, technically, Docker plugins, engine plugins do extend the image config with additional fields, but they do use a new media type for that. And I had the amusing discovery the other day, actually, of looking at Docker engine plugins and realizing that if you consider Docker media types to be equivalent to OCI media types, they are artifacts. They're not artifacts by the artifact spec, but if you consider the media types equivalent, they are because of that. But like BuildKit's inline cache feature, very specifically, this is a bug that's causing 300 megabytes of data to be packed in there, but it very specifically is intended to look like an image, walk like an image, talk like an image, that just has some additional metadata that allows BuildKit to strongly tie build steps to cache blobs that are somewhere else. So, it's from maybe it's
someone
from
at Docker knew someone at BuildKit to talk about this.
Oh, like, absolutely, it's a bug in BuildKit, and solving that is, very much part of the issue. But I guess, Jeff's thought is just, if there's some spec guidance to provide expectations around what's a reasonable, even if it's, we redefine this as a runtime problem, You know, what's a reasonable, like, hey, runtime should support a 4 megabyte image config, and past that, it's up to you to make a judgment call, right? Like that guidance for image authors, you know, again, we're talking about an edge case and a bug. So maybe this is not something that we do need to formalize, but if there is consensus on this is the same behavior and this is a reasonable expectation for future implementations, both producing and consuming images to come to consensus around, there might be some value in that. I don't think there's a build kit issue yet. They're still trying to track down a reproducer.
Oh,
So,
okay,
I mean,
sorry.
we
I was just trying.
Yeah, and we can somewhat separate the build kit part / this will probably lead to discussions likely in private with runtime implementers. But the general case is just that, say that a thing produced a very large config blob, and that could be a buggy build kit, or it could be something that very intentionally packed a lot of data into the config blob. And should there, you know, is there a good play? Should we come to consensus on how large a config blob would be parsed or just not actioned on, rejected by a runtime or a registry or whatnot? And where would the right place be to document such a consensus if it could be reached?
If we're gonna reach consensus, I feel like that's gonna be distribution spec on the upload of the manifest. That would be the only place you could do it.
So does that go back to the, I mean, if we're putting in the distribution spec, that would be the reject the manifest if the config blob is too big, and then let the config blob sit or be GC'd.
Yeah,
Flow.
if you're going to implement it on the registry side. Otherwise, if you're going to implement on the client side, then I could see clients taking an individual decision on that one, but I could also see us saying clients should have supported at least something this big. I'm frankly trying to find our conversation. I think I might have just found it on the WASM artifacts.
Oh, and we're talking about the case of images and not artifacts, John, but like I don't necessarily disagree. I mean, my thoughts right now are mainly along the lines of we have this language in the distribution spec that just sets some all implementations should support at least 4 megabytes. So maybe for config, like something like that for runtimes or things that parse the config, all implementations that parse the config, which could be a runtime, that could be the UI of a registry, should support at least 4 megabytes. And then, you know, past that, it's the Wild West. But if we can at least define some consensus behavior.
I mean, to echo John's comment, I think it's okay as long as we put those limits only around OCI image media config. If it's any other blob, there's no reason for us to put any limits around it.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like, I think it becomes highly tool specific. It's specifically for images where we have this well-defined config that has certain fields and multiple things, the registry, the runtime expect to be able to parse things out of that cheaply even. But if you have an artifact where you define your own config blob, you know, all bets are off. Only the tool that understands that media type has any opinions on what's in that blob, and said tool can enforce its own limits.
So since we're getting into that whole image versus artifact discussion, it was triggering to me thinking back to the WASM discussion. For anybody that's been following that issue, I dropped the link in there, and it's also in the meeting notes for 1137 on the image spec, where there is a back and forth about what makes sense. I think they're looking to clarify the spec itself in terms of whether an artifact is allowed to have a media type and an artifact type and what it should be. I think the overall question this is coming to, though, is what is an image? And we really haven't defined specifically what an image is versus what an artifact is. And different people are coming with very different opinions on what it is. And I think because of that, we're clashing on wording here.
So the way I've been defining, because I was looking at some of this before this PR popped up, I was looking at some of the wording around the artifact type. And I mean, my takeaway is that, we basically have runnable content that we expect a runtime to be able to understand, and we have non-runnable content. But I think where it gets tricky is how are the layers interpreted? What if I have something that is runnable content, but it doesn't follow the classical layering model? It is more artifacty with the layers in that they require some specialized interpretation.
And yeah,
They
it's still
all,
content.
so the thing to remember is they all require specialized interpretation. Linux takes those things and can just take them and diff them, apply the diffs in order and what have you. Windows has a whole other separate thing because they have to create different file system objects and what have you. Actually, in fact, Linux has to do that too, right? Because of /dev and that kind of stuff. So they all have special stuff. You can't just take it and run it necessarily.
And there are a few takes coming out of that issue. One of them was that everything is an artifact. There are no more images at that point. We just make everything an artifact. Everything gets an artifact type, whether or not it's a runnable image or not. There was one take in there that says an image is we're only defining the concept of OCI, and then it's only things that have the specific OCI config media type and the specific OCI layer media types, and anything else doesn't fall into our definition of image. I had a little bit looser of a definition, which was kind of what you were saying. I think both between Bjorn and Brian, which was anything that's kind of runnable would be an image. And depending on where we fall in that definition, wording changes in the spec, I think.
So, I mean, I guess your last version I think is just a little incorrect, Brandon, because it's not just the OCI layer types. Like, other layer types are allowed. Implementations must understand the OCI layer types, but you can have an OCI compliant image with the OCI config media type that has a different layer media type, technically.
You can, but is it an OCI image? And that comes down to what the definition of an image is.
So from my standpoint, because I've been looking at this on the runtime side, and this is where, I ended up looking at that phrasing in the spec. Like this is, I would say, almost the same thing, just from a different angle that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago. What I'm interested in is, as a runtime, I want to know, is this content that I could run or not? Do I care about it or not? And so that's, basically, ideally what I would do is just anytime I'm trying to do any sort of discover what images are in the index or et cetera, if there's an artifact type, I'm just going to, continue in my loop. I'm going to pass over it. And then if it's something that I could plausibly want to run, like say a WebAssembly image, I would like it to be a OCI image and to have the OCI config media type, not to have an artifact type, such that I don't nuke it because it's something I could run. So, and that's a little bit of a fuzzy concept because, what is runnable? I mean, I could have a binary in an artifact, and that technically is runnable, for some sense of the word. But at the very least, like, I would like to define artifact as anything that's not intended to be discovered and run by a container runtime, and image as anything that's intended to be discovered and run by a container runtime. And maybe it's not generic across all runtimes, but we have Windows images, we have Linux images, they have different semantics, as Brian just pointed out. And and yet it moves. It would be nice to try and fit WebAssembly into that world, even if they don't necessarily have their entry point in a traditional rootfs. That's fine. I just want to know that this is runnable content. If you try to run it with runc, runc is going to choke on it at some point, but I could run it with a container wasm shim with runwazi, and it will understand it. Great. That's a UX problem for the runtime. I just want to know, is this something that I could possibly have an implementation that will understand how to run it as a container? Or is this something that is just, and it's a fancy zip file, so it's an opaque blob of data, and I don't want to make any decisions on how to execute it?
And so you're really looking at that config media type from the container runtime side. You're interested in seeing what's over there.
I mean, if Tianan starts going and adding artifact type to the things he's going to build, I'm going to have to go talk to him, because I'm trying to add code to container D that just ignores anything with an artifact type. We're going to have a talk about what makes sense. But I mean, that's exactly this problem of, I would like artifact type to be a signal that a runtime should just ignore this data because it doesn't know how to understand it.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if anybody else here that's on the runtime side, because I feel like I've been trying to make the spec support those use cases. So Mike, Brian, Derek, anybody that knows container D, runc, anything on that end, do you find that sort of thing useful or unnecessary from your?
Sorry, I missed what that sort of thing is.
Runnable runnable artifacts brings up nightmares. we need more context around.
So the context is
you can run an annotation, right? I mean, what does that really mean?
The context here is WASM is saying that their thing is an artifact versus an image, and it turned into a big back and forth of what is an artifact, what is an image, and therefore how should this be formatted so that runtimes know they should try to execute it.
So rather than come up with a WASM image that's runnable, they want to use an artifact and say it's runnable. That's
right. So and then I say I want to add code to container D that just ignores everything with an artifact type, and then container D can't run their WASM images, right? But
right.
So that's actually not what they've implemented. What they've done is said, okay, I've got this image, it's WASM platform, and we've got a image config, and within that image config in the layers, we've stuffed in the WASM modules, and we don't have a rootfs of WASM modules. We have, here's this module, here's this other module, expecting the runtime to go fetch it and stick it in somewhere. But it's not a layer type. It's not like the traditional OCI layer type. It's a different media type for that. And today, as of 2 weeks ago, container D will actually ignore those layers and just continue. If there's other layers in there that are layer types, then it will extract that like normal. But if there's an OCI module type, it just ignores it and lets the runtime, the actual low level runtime, figure out what to do.
So, I mean, that's where I guess I fail to see what the issue is. The layers have always been open to new media types that only a specific runtime understands. So if all they're doing is inventing a new layer type that doesn't layer, but it's just, here's a WASM module, here's a WASM module, here's layers for rootfs, then at least to me, that's a non-issue, because what they still have is an image, and the image just has some layers that need special interpretation, and only a runtime that understands that media type will know what to do. And maybe we can define a default behavior. If you see a layer you don't know how to interpret, skip it, but still interpret the OCI layers. I don't know if that's generic enough to be useful, but that somewhat seems like a non-issue to me. Are there any examples of the actual, what the manifest they want to build look like? Because from reading this pull request, it's really unclear what it's trying to do, and I don't actually have an example in front of me of what.
There's a human formatted version of it. I think the third comment down.
I scrolled past that because it wasn't JSON.
Yeah. Sorry, Reg Cuddle formats things for people, unfortunately. And what it really comes down to is that because they're looking at what they're pushing is not an image, and so that goes back to what is an image, they define as an artifact, and they're pushing in hints to the runtime into the artifact type field, where if we consider an image, you could just put those hints to the runtime in maybe the platform field or as an annotation somewhere else. But they're saying it's an artifact, therefore it must have an artifact type, therefore we're going to put our hint to how the runtime should treat it inside the artifact type.
Okay, so see, it's unclear to me at least how they're making that leap from reading the PR, but that's exactly what I object to. Is I don't want if a runtime's expected to be able to interpret this, even a very specialized runtime, I don't want an artifact type, because this gets back right to the platform matching problem. BuildKit is stuffing unknown and using fake images to pack everything. Like in a world where I can't tell that this is content that a runtime shouldn't interpret reliably based on the artifact type, we're right back to special casing, BuildKit, platform annotation, like platform unknown and known. Attestation, annotation everywhere.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I'm not sure why they're specifically saying artifact, because that's not what is actually implemented.
I mean, they could even just add an annotation on the config descriptor or something like that.
I point out the two options if you don't consider it as an artifact, and that's whether you consider an artifact was always the first question we had to answer. And so now that we've kind of gotten past that point and said, this is probably an image, it could be an annotation. It could also be part of the platform. And so you could say this is a platform variant or something like that we use for other systems. And that way they could pass the hint along over there as well.
Yeah, it would be like WASI P1 versus P2 or whatever they end up calling it.
I mean, this is maybe crystallizing the PR I had brewing for trying to clarify terminology. Because like I almost want to say then that the definition of an artifact should, the definition of an image should be anything that a OCI runtime conformant to our understanding the OCI runtime spec is expected to interpret. And an artifact is anything else. And from a data model, level, the difference is the artifact type or the config media type. So that's, from a data model standpoint, that's what defines the difference. And from a behavioral and semantic standpoint, the difference is an OCI runtime expected to have any opinion on this, or is it not? Is it just opaque to a runtime and a runtime should ignore it?
Makes sense to me. I will follow up on this issue with that and tag both yourself and Brian in this in case there's any other follow-ups in there.
Sure, yeah, I already asked him a question directly too, so just to clarify, because I didn't realize they were using artifact type specifically in the config. So
cool.
I can see why
so
there's a
I
big
threw something
discussion
on the agenda here at the last second that took up about 20 minutes. Oh, who's checking in with people want to know about the milestones? Who's asking about the milestones? Jesse.
I'm not really asking about the milestones. I just was wondering where we're at. And like, I think we keep having like issues added. So I would be happy to kind of burn down that list and help in any way. Cause I kind of think like we're going to come up on a year of just kind of kicking this thing around, and maybe it's time to see if we can get toward a release, especially with image, right? Like Sajay cut RC5, the milestones, there's only like a call for comment and the issue to cut the release. So just kind of wondering where we're at, what people are thinking.
The big blocker I know of is over on the distribution side. And I don't know how comfortable I am pushing for a release of image without knowing that distribution is set.
Which is the big blocker? Because we have 6 issues there.
Yeah, the big one for me is 459, sorry. Allow registries to reject non-existent subjects. And that's the one that myself, Derek, and Bjorn and I will probably go through. I just include myself twice in that last list. We'll go through and put together our thoughts and open up an issue as for the group to put some votes on at some point here. And I'm hoping we'll knock that out in the near future.
Okay.
And if other people have, thoughts on that one, I feel like the three of us have gone back and forth on that one so much we could keep going for another 30 minutes and still get nowhere with it. So if other folks have very strong opinions over there, feel free to chime in.
This issue reminds me of the conformance test will try to delete blobs for that correspond or that are like referenced by existing manifests in the registry. And I think we talked about this in Slack last week. I was not quite, I haven't opened a PR, but was going to propose that registers be allowed to respond with a 409, conflict response code.
And I think, Wayne, you've been opening a bunch of other issues on the conformance test. And so some of those I probably need to put the 1.1 label on, milestone on, just so that we don't run past them trying to knock a release out. I suspect we'll still look at this list one last time, the overall PR list, and make sure we're not missing anything.
Yeah.
But it would be good to make sure that we don't miss that as we're trying to knock out a 1.1 release.
That also reminds me, you brought up the image spec, and I've just been testing my registry with Docker. Like I just pushed my first image, got it to push all the way, but I had to make the Rust OCI spec crate allow descriptor size field to be optional, because previously it had been like required, but there's I think the config media type, or no, the config descriptor coming from the Docker client does not include a size field, which was breaking me for, like 10 minutes. And I was like, oh, wait, I have to make that optional. So where I'm going with this is the image spec actually says the size is always required for a descriptor. But here we have like the, kind of like the main implementation of a registry client, not including a size on a descriptor.
It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, and like one thing that we've aligned on is that like there's a specification and then there are implementations. And I think the thing that we're not aligned on as a working team is that which our focus is. Like, what is our focus? Is our focus making sure that existing implementations adhere to a spec that we think is fluid? Or do we just put a spec out which we think is appropriate and correct, and then implementers can choose to be fully compliant or not? So that definitely, yeah, you're finding something that we've found previously, for sure. And the question is like, what do we want to do about it?
Well, I was thinking about suggesting that we just make that requirement that the size field always be there, be more loose. So it's not like an absolutely required field. I mean, obviously there are like clients out in the wild that aren't using it. And if you absolutely require it, then you have to reject those per spec, right?
Yeah. And I think that's not unique to this spec either, right? Like if you look at, for example, the iSCSI RFC, and you look at the Linux implementation, there's like 15 comments in there that are like, yeah, we don't really do the RFC. And so servers can't, right? I kind of want to understand this group, like, and what our intent is around continuing the 1.1 train with things that are coming up, especially something like this, which has obviously been in place for a long time. I do think, absolutely 100% do think that the compliance suite, the executables that we have, should adhere to the spec that is in that version. But like, as we find more issues, if they're already existing, do we want to further delay 1.1, or do we want to just open an issue and continue on and keep the thing moving forward?
So I don't participate in this group very often. So, maybe somebody's already brought up this idea in the past, but my thinking would be that, you try to match the current version of the spec to what clients are doing. And then you open up an issue and say, well, we actually think the actual behavior should be, say the size field for a descriptor is always absolutely required no matter what. And then that's the next version of the spec. And then those clients don't implement that spec, that new version of the spec until they start matching that required behavior. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I wasn't nodding to agree. It does make sense. I have touched on this before in this forum, so I might like to hear from other people and what they think about that. So I will defer.
The common phrasing that we've said in the past is that OCI has historically been a lagging spec, and so whatever people have implemented before, we made that the spec, and we are entering new territory as OCI starts to define the spec for the first time, before the rest of the community does it. And so that's where we're hitting more friction than we're used to in the past. And it's not that we haven't hit friction in the past. I am curious on your specific example, though. Do you have a public image somewhere that doesn't have the size field? You're on mute.
Muted? Yeah.
Sorry, I have not been doing Zoom calls very often. I've been unemployed for like 9 months. So it's an image I just pushed with Docker 24.0.5 to my registry, and when I don't allow that size field to be optional, it fails to parse the manifest when I'm parsing the manifest to populate the database and verify if all the bits are in the right place. So yeah, I don't have a public image. I can push one to my public GitHub, or not GitHub, Docker, if you'd like. But it was built over the weekend, I think. It's I built it using
BuildKit.
And I built it using Docker.
Okay.
I don't know if I
on a new
BuildKit
version
integrates with Docker, right?
Yeah.
If you don't know and you're
Docker,
using so if you're using 24
you have to have
and you
like
don't know whether you're using BuildKit or not, no.
You have to have the experimental flag enabled in the Docker daemon, right?
No, so since 23, we've made it the default. So if you're using Docker and you haven't explicitly set Docker BuildKit, since 23, you're using BuildKit. Before that, you have to explicitly set Docker BuildKit to 1. By default, you'd use the classic builder.
Okay. Then I must be using BuildKit.
I wonder if that's a recent BuildKit bug, because I haven't seen that myself. But I might have just been not paying close attention.
Yeah, I can push the image to my public Docker hub if y'all want to, try pulling it and inspecting the config.
Yeah, I'll be curious, because if it's a recent BuildKit issue, then that's something that we'll just open an issue up on BuildKit and not change the spec for.
Okay. Well, I can open that issue then, and I can create a minimal reproduction image. And I was gonna open an image on the Rust OCI spec crate, but
yeah, I feel like everybody else is following the spec, and so yeah, if we get a reproducible on that one, I think we can track down wherever that's happening, and I suspect that that's whatever is creating that image just needs a fix.
Okay, cool.
And yeah, you've been finding all kinds of issues and all of our other stuff, so keep finding them for us. That's super helpful.
Yeah.
I started to refactor the conformance test, but I didn't know what shape of refactor would be acceptable to the group, so I kind of gave up on it and decided
I have a vision to completely rip out a lot of the stuff that's in there and to just rebuild it entirely with just a test table and something simple. But knowing that we're on the cusp of trying to get a 1.1 release out and people are a little, on edge trying to work through these last issues, I want to save that until afterwards.
I thought about writing a kind of parallel conformance test suite in my favorite programming language, just because I get so tired of looking at Go code, even after 9 months of not working full time. So
it is good to see other languages, how this stuff works. I don't know. I'll phrase it this way. I do know that most of the stuff we accept over in the OCI repo is Go, just because that's what we have maintainers for. But it doesn't mean that we wouldn't put a reference out and say, hey, here's someone that's done this in another language. Sajay.
I think last call we had a discussion of getting a vote out for 549, the issue. Has anybody taken action on it, or do you? I mean,
Oh boy.
yes, I'm going to be the one annoying trying to get the release out, but I think
no,
this is
no,
an ask
no.
for the distribution maintainers.
We so Derek, Brandon, and I spent hours discussing it in person last week. I mean, I think we are at the, I mean, where we left it, I think, is we are at the point of we would like to have a vote. I mean, we've discussed that for some time. I think the thing that we still, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, Derek or Brandon, but the thing I'm still not sure of is basically what is the vote on? You know, is the vote on specifically that language in the spec, or is the vote on release as is and then try to come up with something that can bring ECR and Docker Hub into conformance later, like the proposed like, you know, like basically is it a delay or go forward, or is it a thumbs up or thumbs down on the specific language? But the thing that we discussed doing when we left it was this week or next week drafting an issue for people to vote on, and basically we just need to bike shed what the description of the issue that we give to people, you know, in 500 words or less is basically. But yeah, Jesse and Sajay, you both wanted to speak.
I just wanted to second what Sajay said. Like, I think a lot of us want to see progress, and I think that's why I brought this up today. Is I want to kind of get through this list of things, and I want to make sure that the list is contained. Like bugs, let's get in there. Forward-looking things, like we spent some time on a transactional API. Like that doesn't feel like something that we need in 1.1. We spent some time on it. This one, I just feel like I want to call the question. Like, I mean, I'm representing an implementation. I don't have a problem with the way the spec is right now. We have garbage collection that might interfere with it. So we're just going to have to prepare for that. Give it a time window. We're going to do something to allow you to push, you know, a reference to something before the actual image is there. We think that that's kind of unlikely as a workflow anyway, but we do have reference sort of specifications out there that indicate that they will do that, right? For like, I think notations spec says that, and I think SigStore was thinking about doing that as well with signatures. So, and Dan made the most recent comment on this today. So like this one in particular, I feel like I just want to drive resolution on, and then yeah, we can figure out how to word it or whatever. That's fine. But I just worry that like another 2 weeks will go by, then we'll have another issue that somebody's interested in. This list of 6 things is like 2 questions, 2 conformance things, 1 thing that's kind of wedged. Like if we could try to burn these down, that would be really cool. Because if that's what's holding up image, then let's get that logjam cleared, and then maybe we can move forward.
So the other option here is if somebody really doesn't like what it is in the shape, they submit a PR, time box the PR and move on. I know that the most painful PR that I've seen was 999, but it did help resolve a bunch of these arguments. We're kind of debating on an issue that has no action at this point. So just deciding on the vote might, if you don't know what the vote is, maybe then go for a PR. But if nobody's opening a PR, time box it, and let's move on with the milestone. That's another option. But again, maintainers need to agree on this, or it'll come down that we're still log jammed on making the release. I mean, it's going on for quite some time. So my ask is just if we can put some kind of an ETA, whatever the ETA is. Like there's no plan right now. That's the other way that I'm seeing that's an issue.
I mean, for what it's worth, like that's like what you're saying, Sajay, and what you're saying, Jesse. That's kind of the mental framing I've been operating with, which is essentially like I don't want to make it a discussion of implementation or not. I want to make it a discussion of, do we release it? 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 Do we r as is, and we know that some implementations will never be able to be conformant with this version of the spec, and we're fine with that, and we accept the consequences of that, whatever fragmentation or confusion or, you know, that results? Or do we want to say, sit down and we have to solve this issue in a way that's satisfactory to everyone? And so that is basically the time box, a question of like, do we just move on and fail forward? And then in a future version of the spec, we'll try to address this, or maybe implementations will change and they can be conformant with this. Or, you know, are we fine with just the state of it where two major implementations can't be conformant, but that's okay?
One of my own thoughts right now is that Docker Hub is conformant with 1.0 today. So I'd love to see it get conformant, and if we can find a scenario where we can get everybody agreeing, that's great. But at the same time, it is one of those scenarios where we're already in the situation to start with. I will point out, for folks,
Brandon. Oh, sorry. I just want to kind of underline what you just said. I think this is a really good thing to call out as an observation. Like, a lot of implementations of tools and registries and things predate the specs, and so like it's kind of a known thing that we might be dealing with kind of in perpetuity, right? So, yeah, it's a good call out.
And I just wanted to let people know that if you've been looking at this saying nothing's been happening, as Bjorn said, we had a long conversation at DockerCon. I started working on just my own thoughts in a markdown document, knowing that we were going to put this up for a vote last week. And so going through different options that I thought of, different possibilities, what could happen. This hasn't been just sitting idle. There's been a lot of thought and a lot of back and forth in the back end trying to get this issue unjammed. I mean, one of the unjam options I'll throw out there is, where did I put it in here? I mean, at some point here, leave as must. Transactions was one of them, but I think one of them was that the subject shouldn't even be a descriptor. And that would be a change to the spec, but at the same time, I don't know how much we really depend on that being a descriptor so much as we just want the digest. And so if it's no longer a descriptor, then it's no longer part of the DAG. And if it's no longer part of the DAG, then we shouldn't have to worry about all this, caring about it from as a child perspective. So there are different ways we can look at this, different options. And I think this one specifically, I put in the chat a while back, haven't heard anybody say back one way or another on this one. But we've got options so we can move forward on this. I think we just need to come to a consensus on which way we want to move forward. Sorry, were you still reading that, Ted? I didn't see.
I have a back. Can you go in? Sorry. Maybe I would ask, how do the authors of that document want to resolve this? Like, should we like share that? Or like,
so right now, that's just been me working to get my notes written down on paper.
Got
it. Bjorn and I were going to get this into, I think, a Google Doc and then get this up as a issue somewhere for people to just put a thumbs up on a vote on. So we're not idle.
Great. Thank you.
That's the thing I want to make sure people think.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that at all. I wasn't at DockerCon, so it completely.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is we kind of went, we're taking up all the air in the room in these weekly calls. So we wanted to take it offline and we went, oh, we're all going to be in person. So it was productive, but I mean, there's less visibility because, well, there was that intention to try to stop taking up all the air on this call.
Well, it's an important issue, and I appreciate it. I'm sure a lot of people appreciate your work on it. So thank you. And thank you, Brandon, for pulling some notes together. That'll be helpful.
Cool. Well, like that, I'm just noticing we only got 5 minutes left. Anybody have last ideas? Or do you want like a quick break to go into the bathroom before your next meeting?
I mean, I guess just maybe the closing thought I have is that, like, I it's absolutely right. And like, to be honest, I'm inclined to say, like, just release as is, and we'll figure out how we can come up with something better that Hub and ECR can support and change the language of the spec in a backwards compatible way. Like, I'm that's kind of where my bias is right now. But despite like this world of, no implementation has ever been perfectly conformant, in many like Hub and ECR, also Quay, predate a formal spec, and have never been quite 100% quite right. I mean, the flip side of that is like, I'm quite highly sympathetic to people like Wayne who are looking at the spec, trying to write a client, clean room in the year 2023, and repeatedly tripping over all the sharp edges that people forgot about, or got used to stepping over, or nobody's, we have what's supposed to be a consensus behavior, but in the real world, nobody really implements it, kind of things. Like, it may be hard to prevent that. That's been the status quo for a long time, but I definitely see the merit in, if we can avoid that situation, trying to avoid it, or try to avoid making it any worse, even if that's been the status quo.
I think we're also going to get a 1.1 release at some point, and with the exception of ROM, it's going to take a while for the rest of the registries to all get updated to the latest version of the specs. So
I think if you have a spec, you can hope that other registries might release, but right now they're not going to move without that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from the user standpoint, don't expect that release of the spec to be instant for all the registries out there.
Yeah, and I just want to avoid the temptation to treat the spec as a cudgel, like the idea of like, well, in a perfect world, this is what all registries should do, and so we're going to put it in the spec, and then we can point the finger at the registry. Like I think that this is supposed to be a forum to generate consensus ultimately, and it's not a forum to try to prescribe behavior to other implementations. And like, again, not that that's what anybody's trying to do here, but that is definitely like one of my fears with, we'll put it in the spec and registries will work towards eventually, is that the perception from outside can be, well, this is the one true way to do it. And, why does this, why is this registry incompetent, essentially? I mean, to put it crudely, but I've definitely seen some of that with some previous optional features in the spec, or things that are like that on the runtime side.
I'm going to leave that as a closing note. So on that closing note, everybody have a great rest of your week, and we'll hopefully make some good progress here so that we can have another step forward here and we don't feel like we're in a stuck state next time, Jesse.
It's not just me.
And
I've just got the highest charisma score, and I'm willing to get out there and roll it. That's all. All right.
And it is very appreciated.
All right. Thank you all. Super lots. All right. Catch you online and next week. Bye.
Take care all.